Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're getting into some really interesting philosophy,
Hmm.
the language of thought hypothesis,
Oh, yeah.
which says that our brains might be using a hidden language,
A hidden language.
sort of like a secret code to think. We
Wow.
call it mentalese.
Okay.
Imagine like a secret code running in the background of our thoughts, right?
That's fascinating. It's not just a fringe idea either.
Right?
It's at the very core of how we understand thinking, how we think.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Like, how do we go from, like, a bunch of sensory input
Yeah,
to, like, a coherent thought about,
right,
a cat sitting on a mat?
right. There's so much there that we
Yeah.
just take completely for granted.
Totally.
So to help us break down this whole idea of mentalese,
Uh-huh.
we've got our expert here to guide us through all the philosophical
Yeah.
twists and turns and thickets.
Right.
So let's start with like the most basic question.
Okay.
What exactly is mentalese?
Well, the core idea is that mentalese, it's a language.
Okay.
And it shares some key features with any language. So it's got like these words, which are
Mhm.
mental representations of concepts,
Okay.
right? And then it's got these sentences, and the sentences are
Mm.
formed by combining these concepts in very specific ways.
Okay.
Just like English, the meaning of the whole mentalese sentence depends on the parts and how they're put together.
So just to be clear,
Yeah.
when I think that cat is fluffy,
Uh-huh.
my brain isn't just having some like vague fluffy cat
Right.
feeling, right?
Right.
It's actually forming this mentalese sentence
Exactly.
with its own distinct
Yeah.
like cat concept and fluffy concept, and then there's some
And,
relationship between the two.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this gets really interesting when we
Yeah.
start thinking about complex thoughts,
Yeah.
like deductive reasoning.
Okay.
So you know that all cats are mammals.
Right.
Right. And Fluffy is a cat.
Okay.
How do you get to Fluffy as a mammal,
Mm.
right?
Right.
Proponents of the language of thought hypothesis, they say that
Uh-huh.
your brain isn't just magically making that connection, it's
Okay.
actually manipulating these mentally sentences.
Interesting.
Almost like a mini logic proof.
So it's not just that we have these mental
It's the structure.
representations, right? It's
Yeah.
that they have this structure that allows for these operations.
Yeah.
This is starting to sound very,
It's starting to sound very computer-like.
yeah, computer-like, yeah.
Yeah.
But before we jump too far ahead,
Okay.
I know this idea's got a pretty long history, right?
Absolutely.
Like, didn't some philosophers way back when,
Centuries ago.
centuries ago,
Think about something
think about this?
very similar.
Yeah, like Augustine and Aquinas?
Yeah, absolutely. They were pondering the nature of mental language way back then.
Oh, wow.
But the modern resurgence is
Yeah.
really due to Jerry Fodor
Oh, right, photo.
Which- and his 1975 book, The Language of Thought.
Classic,
A
right?
classic, yeah. In Philosophy of Mind,
A true giant in the field.
he really is, yeah.
So what were like his main arguments for this
Yeah, so
mentalese idea?
one of the key arguments that Fodor made was that
Hmm.
cognitive science was already
Yeah.
relying heavily on mental representations
Right.
to explain things like perception and memory, right?
Right.
His argument was, look, if these representations are doing so much work already,
Okay.
why not just go all the way
Right.
and think of them as forming a structured language?
So it's almost like he's saying, look, there's a pattern here.
There's a pattern.
Let's follow this pattern
Exactly, yeah.
to its logical
To
conclusion.
its logical conclusion.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
But I'm still curious, though, about what these mental representations actually are.
Yeah.
Like, are we talking about pictures in our heads or
That's
something else entirely?
That's where the
Okay.
representational theory of thought comes in,
Okay.
or RTT for
Yeah.
short. That's the foundation
Okay.
of the language of thought hypothesis.
Gotcha.
So what RTT says is that
Uh-huh.
our thoughts, beliefs, desires,
Mm.
intentions, they're not just these free-floating feelings,
Yeah,
they're about something.
Okay.
They have
yeah.
content, right?
Okay, yeah, my belief that this deep
Yeah.
dive is awesome
Yes.
is about something specific.
Yeah.
It's
It
about
has this deep dive as its
It's
content.
about this deep dive. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I get that. But how does that
Right.
connect to these mental representations and mentalese?
Okay, so
Yeah.
think of it this way.
Okay.
Each thought is like an arrow
Okay.
pointing to a mental representation
Okay.
in your mind.
Okay.
And that representation captures the meaning
Right.
of the thought.
Okay. So when I think cats are awesome,
There's a little mental arrow
mental arrow.
labeled belief,
All right. Okay.
pointing to a representation of cat awesomeness.
Got it.
Right.
And is that the representation? That's what we're calling the mentalese word or sentence.
Precisely.
Okay.
Those mental representations
Okay.
are the building blocks of mentalese.
Got it.
And then the way they combine is what gives rise to
Yeah.
complex meanings, just like
Right.
words in a sentence.
Okay. That makes sense.
Right.
This is kind of blowing my mind.
It is mind-blowing.
A little bit.
Yeah.
But how do we know
Mm,
if these representations have any structure at all, right?
that's right.
Why couldn't they just be this
Jumbled mess of concepts.
Jumbled mess.
Right.
Yeah, that's where the idea of compositional semantics comes in.
Compositional semantics.
Yeah, it's crucial to the language of thought hypothesis.
It basically means that just like any language, the meaning of a complex thought
Okay.
in mentalese depends on the meaning of its parts
Okay.
and how they're arranged, right?
Right. It's like
building with Legos.
building with Legos of meaning.
Legos of meaning. I like that.
I love that.
Yeah, so
So if I'm thinking about a fluffy cat sitting on a red mat,
okay.
my brain is combining those individual concepts.
Yeah.
Right. Fluffy cat, sitting red mat,
Uh-huh.
in this very specific way to create this whole picture.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
And this compositional aspect, it explains how our finite brains can have such a capacity for thought, right? Because just like a finite alphabet can create an infinite number of words, a limited set of mental words and rules can be combined in endless ways.
Yeah, it's like our brains are running these incredible combinatorial
algorithms.
Yeah. But I'm still stuck on this like language part, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Does mentalese have its own logic?
Right.
Like with ands and ors and nots?
Yeah, that's a key question. That gets to the heart of
Right.
how mentalese is supposed to support reasoning.
Yeah.
So many proponents of this idea, they see mentalese as having a structure
Right.
similar to formal logic systems,
Okay.
like predicate calculus.
Predicate calculus?
Yeah.
Okay, now that sounds intimidating.
It does sound intimidating.
Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, I can try.
Non-logicians out there?
So in simple terms, it means that mentalese likely contains these logical connectives, your, ands, ors, nots.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And these allow for complex thoughts to be built from simpler ones.
Okay.
In this very precise way.
Okay, so if my brain has the mentalese cat mammal, and the connective is, it can then create the mentalese thought, cats are mammals.
Exactly. Okay. Right.
And this logical structure is what allows for
that's what allows for the reason
step by step
that we do all the time, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
So it's like our brains are running these. If your brain can represent if P, then Q and P, it can then arrive through a kind of mental logic at Q.
It really is like our brains are running little logic proofs all the time.
Little logic proofs. I love it.
This is making me see my own thinking in such a new light.
That's what philosophy is all about.
Right. But hold on.
Yeah.
Does this mean that
That's a good question.
our thoughts have this like strict logical structure?
Sure, logical structure. That's where things get more complex.
Right. Like what about things like mental images or emotions?
Yeah.
Do those get translated into mentalese logic too?
There's definitely debate on that, right?
Right.
While many, like Fodor, really focus on the logical structure, others argue that there might be different kind of mental representations.
Right. So maybe
different mental activities.
Right. To different systems happening.
Right. So some philosophers think we might use images or maps for certain kinds of thinking.
Right.
Right. How emotions fit into all of this is
a
big open question. Right.
It might be a whole ecosystem
of
mental representation going on, right?
That's right, yeah.
Logical sentences.
Right. We might have images.
Maybe even musical notes.
Yeah. It's like this mental orchestra playing this symphony of our thoughts. Mental orchestra. Yeah, I like that. Okay.
So if we have this innate mental language, this mentalese, right?
Right.
How do we even learn it in the first place?
Right. That's a big question.
Right.
That leads to what's...
Like, do we have to go to mentalese school?
That leads to the learning redress problem.
Okay. Yeah.
So if learning a language requires already...
Right. If I need to have...
Having a language
to learn a language.
Yeah. How do we learn our first language?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Which would be mentalese. So most theorists say it's not... Learn the way we learn English or French.
Okay.
They argue it's innate.
Innate. So we're just born.
It's built into our birth.
Born with this whole mental language pre-installed.
It is a bold claim, I'll admit.
That's a wild idea.
Yeah. But think about it this way.
Okay.
If our brains are structured to process information in a certain way, it would make sense that there would be some basic underlying language hardwired in.
So it's like our brains come with this basic operating system, right?
Yeah. It's like a...
And mentalese is the coding language.
Basic operating system.
That it runs on.
Yeah, I like it.
But if we don't consciously use mentalese, how do we even understand it?
That's a good point.
Right. So understanding mentalese isn't like understanding English or French.
Yeah.
Right. It's not something we consciously do.
Right.
It's more about how our thinking processes operate within the framework of this mental language without us needing to like translate or interpret it.
So it's like just works.
We're all fluent speakers of mentalese.
Fluent speakers of a language we don't know.
Without we don't even
knowing it. The language we think in but never think about. Yeah. Wow. Mind-blowing. Mind-blowing.
Okay, we're going to...
Yeah, so the language of thought hypothesis proposes that this hidden language underlies so much of what our minds do, from basic perception to really complex reasoning.
Right.
So we'll dive into more of that complexity after a quick break.
The tip of the iceberg. Okay.
Stay with us.
All right, we'll be back.
Welcome back. Now, where were we? Yes, delving into why this idea of mentalese is so compelling to philosophers.
Yeah, I'm really curious to know what makes the language of thought hypothesis, so convincing. Is it just that it's like an elegant idea, or are there concrete arguments to back it up?
It's both.
Okay.
So the language of thought hypothesis, it offers this framework that helps explain some really puzzling features of human cognition.
Okay, so give me those explanations.
All right. What mysteries of the mind does mentalese help us solve?
Yeah.
So let's start with the sheer productivity of thought.
Okay.
We, with our finite brains, can generate a potentially infinite
that's always
number of thoughts.
Blowing my mind.
I know, it's amazing.
It's like our thoughts are boundless.
Yeah.
Even though our brains aren't.
Exactly. And the language of thought hypothesis, it offers this elegant solution, just as a finite alphabet can generate an infinite number of sentences.
Yeah.
A limited set of mentalese words and rules can be combined to form an endless variety of thoughts.
So it's that combinatorial logic of language at play again.
Yeah.
But wouldn't any theory
that
used mental representation,
that's a good point,
whether or not they formed a language,
you're right,
explain this?
The productivity of thought alone isn't enough to clinch the argument for mentalese.
Okay, so what else is there?
But the language of thought hypothesis goes further, right?
Okay.
It also accounts for the systematicity.
The systematicity
of
thought. Have you ever noticed? If you can think John loves Mary, you can also think Mary loves John.
Yeah, now that you mention it.
Right.
It's kind of strange how our thoughts can be...
Why are our thoughts so...
rearranged like that?
Interchangeable.
Yeah.
Well, according to the language of thought hypothesis, it's because these thoughts are built from the same mental building blocks.
Okay.
The representations for John, gloves, and Mary.
Okay.
The structure of the mentalese sentence changes.
Okay.
But the components stay the same.
Ah, so it's like having this mental sentence scrambling mean.
I like that. Yeah, it's like a mental...
But what about, like, thinking?
Yeah, thinking processes themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Does the language of thought hypothesis have anything to say about,
absolutely,
how we reason and make decisions?
The systematicity
that we see in our thoughts extends to the processes of thinking, like logical reasoning.
Okay.
This is where the computational aspect of the language of thought hypothesis becomes really important.
Okay, so how does computation fit into this whole picture?
It fits in...
we were talking about logic proofs earlier.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the language of thought hypothesis suggests that those mental logic proofs are actually computations carried out on mentalese sentences.
Right.
It's as if our brains are manipulating these mental symbols according to strict rules, much like a computer program.
So we're not just computers in like the metaphorical sense.
Right.
We might be running literal computations in our heads.
We might be running literal computations.
Using mentalese.
I know. It's a powerful idea.
Right. It's kind of like we're cracking the code of...
Yeah, it makes you wonder...
consciousness here.
Right. We're more similar to computers than we think.
Yeah, it's a really powerful idea.
No, philosophical theory is without its challengers.
Right.
And one of the biggest challenges to this classical computational view of the mind comes from connectionism.
Connectionism, right. That's the one that...
Yeah, that's the one that models the brain.
Models the brain.
As this network of interconnected nodes.
Right, like neurons.
Yeah, like neurons.
So how does that challenge the language of thought hypothesis?
Well, connectionists argue that their models can account for things like productivity and systematicity of thought, but without the need for these explicit symbols and rules. They say that these features can emerge from the complex interactions within a neural network.
So it's like a battle of the algorithms.
The battle.
Right. Rule-based symbol manipulation.
Yeah.
Versus
emergent properties of neural networks.
Right. Who's winning this?
That's the question.
Philosophical battle royale.
Who's win? I don't know. It's tough to call, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Both sides have their strengths and weaknesses, right?
Okay.
The classical language of thought view. It's great at explaining things like logical reasoning.
Okay.
But it struggles to account for the messiness and flexibility of human thought.
Okay.
Connectionism.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's great at modeling, learning, and pattern recognition.
Okay.
But it has a harder time with things like systematicity and compositionality.
Okay. So could they both be right?
Yeah, that's an intriguing possibility.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Some philosophers and cognitive scientists are exploring this.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe our brains use both. Rule-based symbol manipulation and distributed processing.
Okay.
Depending on the task at hand.
Okay.
Or perhaps connectionist networks at a certain level of complexity actually implement something like the language of thought.
Wow, that would be a mind-blowing...
Yeah, it would be a real synthesis.
Yeah.
Yeah. But let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
We touched on this earlier, the learning regress problem.
Yeah, the learning regress problem.
How can we be born with mentalese if learning a language...
If I need a language.
...requires already having a language.
Which to learn a language...
like this.
Right, it's the chicken and the egg.
Chicken and egg.
Of the mind.
Situation for the mind.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's the problem that really pushes people away from the language of thought hypothesis.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
After all, how can you learn a language without already having a language to learn with?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So the language of thought hypothesis really bites the bullet here.
Okay.
Most proponents say that mentalese isn't learned the way spoken languages are.
Yeah.
They argue it's innate.
Innate. So we're just
built into.
Born with this whole mental language.
The very structure of our brain.
Pre-installed.
Yeah. It's a radical idea, I'll admit.
That's crazy, even for philosophy.
But think of it this way.
Okay.
If our brains are physically structured to process information in a certain way, it makes sense that there would be some basic underlying language that reflects that structure.
Okay, so it's like our brains come preloaded with this basic mental vocabulary.
Right, yeah.
And then experience helps us fill in the blanks.
Fill the blanks, yeah.
Those mental words to the real world.
Yeah, that's the general idea.
Okay.
Of course, the details are still being worked out, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do those innate mental words get hooked up to the right things?
Yeah, how does that mapping even happen?
In the world.
It can't just be magic.
Right.
Right.
Some philosophers propose that it might involve a kind of innate conceptual structure, a predisposition to categorize the world in certain ways that match up with our mentalese vocabulary.
Interesting. So it's like our brains have a built-in blueprint.
It's like
for understanding.
Yeah, for understanding.
Well, mentalese is the language the blueprint's written in.
Yeah, exactly.
But if all this is happening beneath the surface, how do we even know any of this is going on?
That's a crucial point.
I mean, we don't consciously speak
so
mentalese.
We don't experience mentalese directly.
Right.
Understanding it isn't like understanding English or French. It's more about how our thinking processes operate seamlessly within the framework of this mental language. We don't need to consciously translate or interpret it. It just works.
Like we're fluent speakers.
We're fluent speakers.
Of mentalese.
Without even knowing it.
Without even knowing it.
The language that we think in but never think about.
The language we think in.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. But
doesn't this raise...
It does raise...
some serious questions about the relationship between mind and brain?
Yeah.
Like, if our thoughts are like sentences
in
a mental language, are we... Then basically just computers.
That's a question that's haunted philosophers for decades.
And it brings us to the computational theory of mind. Right? Many proponents of the language of thought hypothesis also believe that the mind is, at its core, a computational system.
Okay, so are those two ideas, language of thought and the computational theory of mind?
Yeah. So it's
inseparably linked.
They're not.
You have to believe.
They're not inseparably linked.
That the mind is a computer. If you buy into the idea of mentalese.
Not necessarily. They all go hand in hand, but they are technically distinct ideas.
Okay, so it's more like a close partnership.
Yeah, it's more like a close partnership.
Than a shotgun wedding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. But I can see how they complement each other.
How they complement each other, right?
Yeah.
If our thoughts are like sentences in this mental language, it's not such a big leap to think of our brains as processing those sentences like a computer processing code.
Yeah, exactly. The computational view offers a way to think about how those mental symbols are manipulated to produce thought processes.
Okay, so we've got this like elegant and powerful theory.
Right.
That explains a lot about how we think.
But
are there any like cracks in this?
That's a great question.
Mentalese edifice?
Right.
I imagine there must be some criticisms.
There are.
this whole idea?
The language of thought hypothesis?
Right. What do the naysayers have to say?
Well, of course.
Okay.
It has its share of critics,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Some argue it's too simplistic, that it can't capture the richness and complexity of human experience. Others point to the difficulty of explaining how a purely syntactic system, like Mentalese is portrayed, can have genuine semantic content.
Right. It's one thing to say.
Right. So it's one thing to say
that our brains are manipulating symbols.
Yet our brains are manipulating symbols.
But how do those symbols actually get hooked up to?
But how do they get hooked up?
Meaning in the real world.
To meaning.
That connection can't just be arbitrary.
Right. That's often called the grounding problem.
The grounding problem.
For mental content.
Okay.
And it's a challenge that keeps philosophers of mind up at night.
Yeah.
Whether or not they endorse the language of thought hypothesis.
So it's an equal opportunity headache.
It is.
But setting aside the grounding problem.
Yeah.
Are there like other
there are
more specific objections to
so
the language of thought hypothesis?
One common objection is that it's too cognitively centered.
Okay.
It focuses mainly on high-level thinking.
Okay.
And it doesn't say much about things like perception, emotion, or even action.
So it's like Mentalese is.
Yeah. It's like
only in charge of the boardroom meeting.
It's only in charge of the boardroom meeting.
In our minds, but it's got no say. In what's happening on like the factory floor. Of perception and action.
I like that. Yeah. It's like Mentalese is up in the ivory tower. Making decisions, but has no control. Over the workers.
Okay, what other criticisms are there?
Right, so critics argue that a complete theory of mind needs to account for these other aspects of our mental lives, and they question whether the language of thought hypothesis can be extended to cover them.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, if Mentalese...
If it's going to be the language of thought, it needs to be able to talk about everything.
It needs to be able to talk about
the mind does, not just
everything.
Abstract reasoning.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
Another line of attack comes from those who argue that it's ultimately unnecessary. Right. They suggest that we can explain everything it explains without actually positing a mental language.
Okay, so they're saying, look, we can achieve the same results.
Yeah, they're saying, look, we can achieve
without all this
the same results without all of this.
Right.
Mental grammar fuss.
Yeah.
They point to things like dynamical systems theory and embodied cognition as alternative frameworks.
Okay, so it's like the language of thought hypothesis is facing some stiff competition in the marketplace of ideas.
It is, right? But that's what makes philosophy of mind so fascinating. It's a field full of lively debate where these fundamental questions about the nature of our own minds are constantly being challenged and defined.
I love it. I love how we're, getting to explore these
it's great.
Deep philosophical waters.
Right.
But we've only skimmed the surface of one final and quite intriguing. For the language of thought hypothesis.
Right.
It's the argument from cognitive science.
Yeah, cognitive scientists.
We'll dive into that after a quick break. And we're back, ready to wrap up our exploration of Mentalese. We've talked about the basics of the language of thought hypothesis, its strengths and weaknesses, even its rivals. There's one last piece of the puzzle we need to look at.
Okay.
This idea that the language of thought is already
woven into.
Yeah, woven into the very fabric of cognitive science.
Ah, yes, the argument from cognitive science practice.
Yes.
It's subtle, but it's a powerful argument.
Okay.
And it just might be the most compelling one for the language of thought hypothesis.
So how are scientists unknowingly using the language of thought hypothesis in their work?
Well, okay, maybe not all of them are unknowingly using it, but the argument is this.
Okay.
When cognitive scientists build models of the mind, whether it's for perception, memory, decision-making, you name it, they often rely on this idea of mental representations.
Okay.
These models treat the mind as a system that manipulates symbols.
Right.
And those symbols, they stand in for things in the world.
So it's like scientists are already speaking Mentalese.
Yeah.
Without realizing it.
Exactly.
Okay, but isn't that a bit circular?
That's a great question.
Like saying we believe in Mentalese because our research, which already assumes Mentalese, reports it.
Right. It's not just about assuming those representations exist.
Okay.
The point is this. These representational models, they've been incredibly successful at explaining all sorts of cognitive phenomena.
Okay.
They've led to new discoveries, testable predictions, a deeper understanding of how our minds work.
So it's not just a matter of, faith.
It's not just a matter of faith.
Or philosophical preference.
It's got a track record.
The language of thought hypothesis has a track record.
Yeah.
It's proving its worth in the real world.
Exactly. If the language of thought hypothesis were just some arbitrary philosophical idea, it wouldn't have this kind of impact on scientific practice.
Okay.
But the fact that scientists find it useful, that it helps them make sense of the data, suggests that it's capturing something real about how our minds operate.
So the language of thought hypothesis isn't just this ivory tower idea.
It's down in the trenches.
Yeah, it's down in the trenches.
Making a real difference.
Yeah. But does this mean that all cognitive scientists are on board with this idea?
Well, there are always different perspectives in science.
Yeah.
Ongoing debates.
Right.
Not every cognitive scientist is going to, explicitly endorse the language of thought hypothesis.
Yeah.
But even among those who might not fully subscribe to it, many still use mental representations in their work.
Right.
And that, according to this argument, lends support to the idea of a mental language.
It seems like the language of thought hypothesis is winning the popularity contest.
At least for now.
Yeah.
It's elegant, it's powerful.
It's elegant, it's powerful.
It's backed up by scientific practice.
Yeah, but as we wrap up this deep dive, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, absolutely. The language of thought hypothesis, it's a gateway to this vast world of questions about the nature of minds and language, even reality itself.
Yeah, it's like we've just glimpsed this hidden dominion and this secret code running in the background of our everyday lives.
And while there's still a lot we don't know,
right.
a lot of debates raging on in the philosophical arena.
Of course.
The language of thought hypothesis gives us this powerful framework for understanding ourselves and the world around us.
It reminds us that even our most basic thoughts might be far more complex and structured.
More complex than we realize.
Yeah. Right. It suggests that beneath the surface of our conscious experience, there's this hidden world of symbols and computations.
Yeah.
This mental language that allows us to think and reason and create.
A language that, in a sense, makes us who we are.
And on that thought-provoking note, we come to the end of our deep dive into this fascinating world of mentalese.
The fascinating world of mentalese.
But I suspect this is just the beginning of our exploration, right?
I think so.
The language of thought hypothesis raises questions that linger.
It really does.
Long after the deep dive ends.
Yeah.
It prompts us to reflect and to appreciate the wonders of the human mind.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe one day we'll crack the code of mentalese completely. Unlock even deeper secrets of how your mind works.
Until then, keep those mental gears turning, listeners, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the mysteries of the universe.
See you next time.